Welcome to the Deep Dive, where we take your sources and dig into the most compelling insights.
Hi there.
Today, we're cracking open a stack of materials you shared with us and diving deep into the remarkable modern economic history of Bahrain.
Yeah, this looks fascinating. We've got quite a journey laid out in these sources. We'll be tracing Bahrain's story, from its ancient roots as a trade center
Right.
through the whole pearl trade thing, the boom, and then that dramatic collapse.
Yeah, that collapse sounds like a major turning point.
Absolutely. And then, of course, the discovery of oil, which changed everything again, and its ongoing efforts, which are really deliberate, to build a more diversified sort of post-oil future.
It's a story of navigating just massive change, isn't it, for this island nation right there in the southern Arabian Gulf. So our mission today is basically to understand the key forces, the moments that really shaped its economy, its society, using these materials you sent as our guide.
Exactly. Think of it like we're uncovering the economic DNA of a country that's had to reinvent itself, well, more than once.
Okay, let's get into it then. Let's unpack this.
Yeah.
To start, maybe let's just get our bearings.
Yeah.
Where exactly is Bahrain and what were its earliest resources according to these sources?
Okay. Well, the sources put Bahrain right in the middle of the southern Arabian Gulf. It's kind of nestled east of Saudi Arabia and just north of Qatar.
Got it.
And it's an archipelago, so a cluster of islands and shoals. Over 84 of them, actually.
84? Wow.
Yeah, a mix of natural ones and artificial ones, too.
That's a lot of coastline then for what sounds like a pretty small land area. The total land is just under 800 square kilometers.
That's right. And the main island, also called Bahrain, makes up about 80% of that.
Okay.
But the territorial water area, that's much, much larger, over 7,400 square kilometers.
And it's mostly flat, the landscape.
Yeah, generally flat. The highest point, Jabal al-Duhan, is barely 134 meters.
So that geography, it immediately suggests a really strong connection to the sea, doesn't it?
It really does. And when you look at the resources described early on, fresh water was, well, historically critical. It came from this aquifer system, the Daman aquifer.
Okay.
But the sources flag a serious issue today. Over-extraction, seawater getting in. It's really degraded that supply, those natural springs. The ones in the north that were kind of famous in earlier times, they actually stopped flowing back in the 1980s.
Wow. So those historical names like Land of Immortality or Great Paradise linked to the springs, they feel pretty distant now.
They do, but the really big early resource, the one that just leaps off the page in these materials, is pearls.
Ah, right. The pearls.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The oyster beds just north of the main island, they were the heart of this massive natural pearl fishery. It dominated the entire Arabian Gulf for centuries.
Muharraq is even mentioned as the capital of this whole pearling world.
That's what the sources say. Yeah. Muharraq was the center.
And this wasn't just like local trade, was it?
Not at all. By the 19th century, demand just exploded from places like Bombay, Persia, Turkey, and then later, Europe and the US got involved.
And that transformed Bahrain's economy.
Completely. It became essentially a single product economy. Everything centered on pearls.
The numbers must be pretty stark.
Oh, they are. The data here is remarkable. As early as 1877, pearls were 75% of Bahrain's total exports.
75%. What?
And it gets even more intense. Fast forward to around 1904-05, and an estimated 97.3%, nearly all of the entire Gulf pearl trade turnover was happening through Bahrain.
97%. That's incredible dominance.
It is. You had merchants coming from Paris, London, New York, all descending on the island looking for the best pearls. It wasn't just important, it was, well, overwhelmingly the whole economy.
Okay. So besides pearls, what else was there? Agriculture and fishing are mentioned?
Yeah, they played vital roles, but more for, local food security, keeping people fed.
And the sources say there are still efforts today to boost those sectors.
That's right. Government initiatives mentioned include things like cutting fees, providing loans or subsidies, developing labs, farmers markets, even exploring newer things like fish farming and hydroponics.
Shows a kind of persistent effort to use local resources where possible, doesn't it?
Exactly. Trying to maintain some level of food self-sufficiency.
And then the game changer, oil and gas.
Yes. The resource that would change absolutely everything. Bahrain was actually a pioneer in the region here, the first country on the Arabian Peninsula to discover crude oil. That was back in 1932.
And the refinery started up pretty quickly after that, 1936.
Yep, operations began in 36.
Oil's still a key part of the economy today, I gather, even though the reserves mentioned here, about 124 million barrels, sound relatively small compared to some neighbors.
They are relatively small, yes. And it's interesting where the revenue actually comes from. There's the original onshore field, the one found in 32.
Yep.
And then there's the offshore Abu Safa field, which was found in 63.
Yeah.
And that one is shared with Saudi Arabia.
Ah, shared. That's a really important detail.
It's crucial. And while, exploration is always ongoing, there was that big announcement in 2018 about potentially huge tight oil and gas reserves offshore.
Right. I remember reading something about that.
Yeah, but the sort of day-to-day reality, the limited, proven, and importantly, easily extractable reserves compared to giants like Saudi Arabia or Kuwait, that's always been a key factor shaping Bahrain's long-term economic thinking. We'll definitely see that theme come up again.
Okay. So let's rewind a bit now. Let's follow that thread back, before pearls became quite so dominant. The sources trace Bahrain's history way back, over 5,000 years. Civilizations like Dilmun, Tylos, Awal.
That's right. Those ancient names we mentioned earlier, Land of Immortality, Great Paradise, they probably point back to that era when fresh water was more plentiful.
Makes sense.
But more than just water, Dilmun was this incredibly important commercial hub. Excavations show it. It was a bustling marketplace, a sea transit point connecting major ancient powers. We're talking Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley, maybe even links to the Nile Valley. And this was happening as early as the 3rd millennium BC.
So it wasn't just a stopover point. It was like a central node in ancient global trade.
Exactly, a vital link.
Right.
Then you fast forward to the Tylos period. That name came from the Greeks after Alexander the Great's general Neuchus explored the area.
And pearls were already famous then. Pliny the Elder was writing about them.
He was. In the 1st century AD, Pliny commented on Bahrain's beautiful pearls. The economy then was built on more than just pearls, though. Shipbuilding, fishing, exporting dates, other agricultural stuff. But yeah, pearls were already a known luxury.
The sources also mention Christianity being adopted for a time.
Yes, and an Nestorian church seat being present for a period before Islam arrived peacefully in 640 AD.
Right. And Awal was the name for the island itself before then.
Specifically the main island, yeah. Bahrain used to refer to a broader region on the mainland before it became tied just to the archipelago.
And the arrival of Islam was peaceful, you said.
Yes, the sources highlight that. And interestingly, they mention Christians and Muslims coexisting for about 2 centuries after that, with Bahrain's income actually contributing to the Muslim treasury.
Fascinating bit of history. Okay, so this long timeline brings us up to what the sources call modern Bahrain, starting around 1783 with the Al Khalifa family rule.
And the reign of Sheikh Isa bin Salman Al Khalifa, starting in 1961, is highlighted as a really key period for modern nation building. That led up to independence in 1971 and the first constitution in 73.
And then the move towards a constitutional monarchy under HM King Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa from 1999 with the amended constitution in 2002 is framed as sort of continuing that modernization process.
Exactly. Now, if we zoom in on those early years under Al Khalifa rule, right after 1783, the sources talk about swift commercial progress in the first couple of decades.
Okay, so trade picked up quickly. What were the reasons for that?
Well, the sources point to 3 main factors. First, that crucial location again.
Geography is destiny, right?
Pretty much. It wasn't just a historical link anymore. It became a key point for collecting and then re-exporting goods. Stuff flowing between India, Mesopotamia, and later, goods coming from Europe.
Okay, location. What else?
Second, the commercial skills of the UTEP. That's the tribal group the Al Khalifa family belonged to. They had a history in trade. They developed Al Zabara as a commercial center before coming to Bahrain.
So they had experience.
Exactly. They had expertise, good relationships, especially with India, and a solid reputation. They leveraged that.
Makes sense. And the third factor?
Relative political stability. The early 19th century Gulf could be pretty chaotic. British involvement and the agreements they made, well, they brought interference, sure, but also a degree of stability compared to some other places which helped trade.
Right. Stability is usually good for business. Are there numbers from back then?
Yes. The sources give us some data from 1824, and it really hammers home how dependent Bahrain was on pearls even then.
Great.
Out of about 1.6 million Austrian reals in total exports, nearly 97% was just pearls.
97%. So everything else was tiny.
Pretty much. Dates and some locally made hemp cloth were the next biggest, but they were way behind, like less than 1% each.
Where were these pearls going?
India was the biggest market by far, took almost half the exports. Then Persia, Basra, other parts of Arabia, and Turkey.
Okay, what about imports? What was coming in?
Well, the total trade volume for that year, 1824, was around 2.4 million Austrian reals, about 490,000 pounds sterling back then. Exports were about 2/3 of that, imports the other third.
So more going out than coming in value terms.
Right. And the sources actually say these numbers show Bahrain's flourishing trade during this period.
Interesting. Where did the imports come from?
Mainly India, Basra, and Persia. India sent things like rice, sugar, spices, metals, timber, fabrics, manufactured goods and raw materials. Basra and Persia sent more dates and dried fruits.
And was Bahrain using all these imports?
Here's a telling detail. The sources say the majority of the imports from Basra and Persia were actually just re-exported straight on to India.
So Bahrain was acting like a middleman again, a transit point.
Exactly. Less about consuming those particular goods, more about moving them through. Its role as a hub was really clear.
Okay. So trade was strong, then maybe dipped a bit?
Yeah, there was a decline after some internal problems in the late 1830s, but it picked up again strongly after 1869 under Sheikh Isa bin Ali. Things settled down, relatively speaking.
And trade boomed again.
Exceptionally so, especially in the early 1900s. By 1905-06, the value was over £3 million sterling, a huge amount for the time.
What about money? What currency were they using?
It was a mix, apparently, lots of different currencies floating around, but Indian rupees were the most popular for general trade.
Okay.
Interestingly, though, during the pearl diving season, Maria Theresa Taylors or Riles were preferred. The sources say the divers specifically liked them.
Wonder why. Maybe they felt more solid.
Could be. And another sign of the times, the first proper customs system was set up in 1860, and it was partly run by resident Indian merchants known as Banyans.
Which the sources see as a sign of British economic influence growing.
Yes, that's flagged as an early manifestation of that.
Okay, so the pearl economy is booming into the early 20th century. Then World War I happens. What impact did that have?
Well, it obviously caused disruption. The Gulf became a bit of a battlefield, and commercial activity largely seized up for a while.
But it bounced back.
Pretty quickly afterwards, yeah. Trade recovered, and Bahrain actually strengthened its position. It became a major distribution hub for goods coming into the Arabian Peninsula during the 1920s and 30s.
So the shift to modern steamships didn't hurt Bahrain?
No, the sources say it actually helped, in a way, because companies like the British India Maritime Company used Bahrain's ports as their central distribution point for the goods arriving on these bigger, modern ships.
Interesting. So it adapted to the new logistics. Was there a shift in where goods were coming from?
Yes, that's noted too. During the first quarter of the 20th century, there was a noticeable shift. More imports started coming directly from Britain rather than predominantly from India as before.
Okay. But while Bahrain was succeeding as a trade hub, the actual source of its wealth, the pearl trade, that was heading for disaster, right?
Absolutely. It was entering what the sources call a death spiral. It wasn't just one thing. It was a perfect storm.
Like what?
Post-war price swings, global economic problems, the Wall Street crash absolutely hammering demand for luxury goods like pearls.
Right. Pearls are a classic luxury item.
Exactly. But the killer blow really was the arrival of cheap, mass-produced, cultured pearls from Japan.
The Mikimoto story. That completely undercut the natural pearl market, didn't it?
Totally. It just destroyed the price point for natural pearls. Add to that internal problems, like riots by divers whose incomes were collapsing. The whole trade just went into steep decline in the 1930s and was basically finished by 1950.
And this is where customs duties become really important again.
Hugely important. Because before oil money started flowing, customs duty was pretty much the only significant source of government income.
How significant?
The sources give a really stunning figure. In 1930, customs duty made up about 97% of the total national income.
97%. I mean, that's basically everything.
It is. It just shows how incredibly vulnerable that economy was. One revenue stream, totally dependent on one luxury export. When that collapsed and global trade slumped at the same time, the government's income just vanished.
Yeah, that kind of dependency is terrifying. It also explains why they needed things like the Manama City Council, founded back in 1919, to manage customs, right?
Exactly. It was the main administrative task related to revenue.
So at this specific time, say the early 20th century, just before oil really hits, what else was going on economically besides pearling?
Well, obviously pearling employed the vast majority when it was booming, but people still needed to eat. They needed basic goods. So you had local crafts, agriculture, fishing still active.
Dates were important, you mentioned?
Yes, dates were the second biggest export after pearls, but agriculture generally struggled. A lot of workers preferred the potential riches of pearling, plus they had issues with soil salinity and, old farming methods.
And local crafts? What kind of things?
The sources list pottery, especially in Ali village, weaving in places like Abu Saiba, mat weaving in Sitra, basket weaving, and crucially, boat building.
Ah, boat building. That must have been huge for the pearl trade.
Absolutely vital. They built the dhows, the boats the divers use. So unsurprisingly, when the pearl trade collapsed, the boat building industry collapsed right alongside it.
A real domino effect.
Definitely. Which brings us squarely into the period the sources call 1925 to 1937. A difficult period is putting it mildly. You've got the pearl market collapsing and the Great Depression hitting globally.
Double whammy.
Big time.
Mm.
With pearls gone, customs became the main income source, but that income itself was shrinking fast because of the Depression.
Is there data showing this income drop?
Yes, the revenue table in the sources is really stark. Look, initially government revenues were around, say, 11 to 14 lakhs of rupees per year.
Which is about 1.1 to 1.4 million Indian British rupees.
Roughly, yeah. And that was enough for basic administration and maybe some small public improvements, well, as well as a bit of electricity, some roads.
That's manageable.
But then, starting around 1930-31, you see the drop. Revenue falls sharply, down to like 6-8 lakhs.
Ouch.
And the absolute hardest years were 1932-33 and 1933-34. Income shrank to less than 7.3 lakhs. It wasn't even enough to cover basic government spending. It was a genuine crisis.
Wow, that's dire.
But then you see a little glimmer of hope appearing in that same table. Oil revenue.
The first signs. How much was it initially?
Tiny amounts, like 29,000 rupees in 1933-34, then 67,000 the next year. Peanuts, really.
Okay, but it was a start.
It was.
Yeah.
And then look at the next 2 years, 1935-36 and 1936-37. The oil revenue suddenly jumps dramatically, over 500,000 rupees, then nearly 700,000.
Whoa, that's a significant leap.
Huge. And you see total government revenue rebound because of it, back up to 13.4 lakhs, then 16.5 lakhs in those last 2 years shown.
So you can literally see the transition happening in the government's books.
Yeah, absolutely. You can track the customs contribution percentage dropping from over 70, even up to 90-something% before the crash, down to around 50% by 1936-37. Oil revenue is rapidly filling that gap.
What did the government do during those really lean years before the oil money kicked in properly?
They had to make some really tough choices. Staff reductions, pay cuts across the board for all government employees. They increased customs duties on some luxury items, tobacco, alcohol.
Trying to squeeze revenue wherever they could.
Exactly. And they had to dip into their reserve fund just to, well, weather the storm, as the sources put it.
Sounds incredibly difficult.
It was. The sources actually credit the cooperation of everyone, the ruling family, the employees who accepted cuts, the public, for getting through it.
And they explicitly link the recovery to oil.
Yes. The text says flat out, the discovery of oil greatly helped Bahrain to overcome this crisis. It wasn't just a new income stream. It was a lifeline arriving at the absolute lowest ebb.
What about the impact on ordinary people? The pearl divers, the boat builders?
It's devastating. Just devastating. The sources include a table on boats and divers that really tells a story of mass unemployment and, frankly, poverty.
Right.
Remember, most men worked in pearling or something related like boat building.
Right. So when that vanished.
Their livelihoods vanished. Look at boat production. Before the slump, they were building maybe 95 boats a year. By 1930-31, that dropped almost 60% down to 40 boats.
Wow.
And it fell even further, hitting a low of just 11 boats built in 1932-33.
11. From nearly 100. That's catastrophic for the builders.
It is. And for the divers, their average annual salary crashed. From around 200 rupees a year, it plummeted down to 110, then 60, then just 40 rupees.
40 rupees for a whole year's work.
For a year! Imagine trying to feed a family on that. The sources mention this caused a lot of trouble and disturbances. I think that's probably an understatement for the hardship and desperation people felt.
Yeah, disturbances sounds pretty mild for that kind of economic shock.
And the sheer numbers involved, the total number of divers and boats actively working, it basically halved between 1929-30 and 1936-37. Over 10,000 divers lost their jobs in that short space of time.
10,000. In a small place like Bahrain, that's enormous.
It's huge. And even the value of the pearls they already had, the ones cashed and waiting to be sold, that collapsed by over 70% too. So no escape there either.
So this whole period, 1925 to 1937, it sounds incredibly bleak. Huge unemployment, poverty, social unrest.
It was. Some workers did manage to shift, especially into the brand new oil industry as it started up. But remember, this was also during the global Great Depression. Options were really limited for most people.
A really tough transition.
Incredibly tough. But as the sources conclude, despite all that hardship, this period was the beginning of a radical transformation, the end of one era and the very difficult birth of another.
Which brings us squarely to that transformation's engine, the discovery of oil and how it all unfolded. That discovery in 1932 really was a milestone, wasn't it? Changed the country's path forever, a lifeline, as the sources call it.
Absolutely. But it wasn't like it happened completely out of the blue. There was groundwork laid, signs were there.
Like what?
Well, the sources mention things like oil seepage. There was a specific water well, Ain Algar, known historically as the Spring of Bitumen.
Bitumen? Like asphalt.
Exactly. And they've even found evidence from the ancient Dilmun era showing bitumen was used for waterproofing boats and things. So people knew this stuff was around in some form for a very long time.
And geological surveys later on confirmed it.
Yes, surveys in the early 20th century indicated oil was present. So the real question wasn't if there was any oil.
It was if there was enough to be commercially viable.
Right.
And worth the huge investment to get it out.
Precisely. And this is where Major Frank Holmes comes into the story. He's often called the father of oil in Bahrain and the Gulf.
Okay. What did he do?
Well, he came looking for oil, but he was clever about it. The government needed help drilling artesian water wells. Holmes offered to help with that.
Ah, foot in the door.
Exactly. And used that project as cover to do geological surveys. He confirmed there was commercial potential.
But his first company wasn't interested.
No. The Eastern General Syndicate didn't want to pursue it in Bahrain. So Holmes took the concession to the U.S. It got passed around a bit. Eastern Gulf Oil bought it, then sold it to Standard Oil of California.
SoCal.
SoCal, okay.
Big name.
Right. And they set up a subsidiary, the Bahrain Petroleum Company, BAPCO, registered in Canada, actually, to handle the Bahrain operations.
And BAPCO found the oil.
They did. Started exploring in early 1930, and boom, June 1932, well, no. One hits oil in commercial quantities. Then we'll know 2 confirms it in December.
Okay, so oil is confirmed. Commercial quantities. What happens next? Building everything needed to actually use it.
Pretty much. Work started on 2 tracks. Keep exploring, to find the extent of the field, and build all the necessary infrastructure from scratch.
And that must have been a massive undertaking.
Huge. The sources detail some of it. They had to build an export terminal. They chose Sitra, on the east coast of Sitra Island. Construction started early 1934.
How did they even get the equipment there?
Get this. The heavy gear arrived on a Soquel oil tanker, the El Segundo, and that tanker literally served as a floating hotel for the construction workers.
A floating hotel? That's amazing.
Isn't it? And that same tanker, the El Segundo, carried the very first shipment of exported Bahraini crude oil.
Wow. Do we know where it went?
We do. The sources say it went to Japan, sailed on June 7th, 1934, a really specific date marking the start of the oil era.
Incredible detail. What else did they build?
An oil collection and storage station near the wells. That actually produced the first small batches of gasoline used to run the machinery at the Sakir oil field itself.
Bootstrapping almost.
Kind of. Then the refinery. Shipping crude all the way to the U.S. was expensive, so SoCal decided to build a refinery right there in Bahrain. Work started late 1935.
When did it open?
First phase opened June 1936, second phase end of 1937, and it kept expanding, especially after Saudi Arabia found oil next door in 1938. The Bahrain refinery started processing Saudi crude too.
Right. Became a regional refining center.
For a time, yeah. It grew into one of the biggest refineries in the region, reaching a capacity of 250,000 barrels per day by 1968.
Did the oil industry change how people lived, like where they lived?
Definitely. Awali Town is a prime example. Founded in 1934 near that first oil well, named by Sheikh Hamad bin Isa Al Khalifa. The sources call it the first modern town in Bahrain.
Modern in what way?
Planned layout, modern facilities. It even had the first central air conditioning plants in Bahrain. Though initially it was mainly for the oil company executives and senior staff, but it served as a model.
Okay. What about getting the Saudi oil over to the refinery before pipelines?
Good question. After the Saudi discovery in 1938, they set up a system. Khobar in Saudi became a shipping point, and Zalak on Bahrain's west coast became a receiving point.
So tankers shuttled it across.
Initially, yes. Tankers brought Saudi crude to Zalak, it went into storage tanks, then got pumped across the island to the refinery. They used a special pier at Zalak for this from 1938 until 1945.
And then pipelines took over.
Exactly. Undersea pipelines were completed in 1945, allowing Saudi oil to flow directly to the Bahrain refinery. much more efficient.
They even built a factory for drums and cans.
Yeah, established in August 1944. Initially, it was a partnership with the U.S. government for World War II, making containers to ship oil products to the U.S. military. After the war, it switched to making cans for civilian commercial use.
Busy times. And then there was that agreement with Saudi Arabia about the offshore areas.
Right, the 1958 Maritime Border Agreement. That was really significant. There had been long negotiations about who had rights to explore where in the offshore waters between them.
And how did it shake out?
Well, the Abu Safa area ended up under Saudi control, but, and this was the crucial part for Bahrain, the agreement gave Bahrain the right to 50% of the production if oil was discovered there.
50%. And oil was discovered.
It was. Discovered in 1963, production started in 1966. And today, as we mentioned earlier, that shared Abu Safa field provides the majority of Bahrain's oil revenue. A really vital agreement for Bahrain's finances.
Okay, so oil arrives, provides this lifeline, funds development. But we also talked about how Bahrain knew its oil wouldn't last forever compared to its neighbors. This leads to the wider story of modernization, right? And the sources argue this started even before the big oil money came in.
Yes, that's a key point they make. Modernization wasn't just about oil wealth arriving. It had roots earlier, picking up pace with the stability under Sheikh Isa bin Ali from 1869.
And was a joint effort, government and people.
That's how the sources frame it, a result of cooperation. Some things were government-led, others came from the people, like notables, with government support. Charles Belgrave, the advisor, is quoted confirming that early initiatives in health, education, municipalities, electricity, roads, they all started before oil became dominant.
But oil money must have massively accelerated everything.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
Dramatically. Both the scope and the speed of modernization increased significantly after 1932.
So let's look at some of those areas. How did the administrative system develop?
Well, we mentioned the Manama municipality starting in 1919. Then in 1924, the Manama Municipal Council was formed 24 members. And significantly, the sources note, it was partially elected by secret ballot.
The first election in Bahrain, it says.
That's what's cited here.
Yeah.
More councils followed in other towns later. Then bigger reforms under Sheikh Salman in 1956 established an administrative council.
And after independence?
You get the Council of Ministers in 71, the Constituent Assembly elected in 72 to write the Constitution, the first Parliament elected in 73, and later the Shura Council in 92.
And then the shift to a constitutional monarchy in 2002 under H.M. King Hamad is seen as the next step in that institutional development.
Exactly. It's presented as a continuous process.
What about education? How did that evolve?
Before the 20th century, it was mostly traditional religious schooling, Quranic schools, The American Mission opened a school in 1899, which was modern but had limited reach.
So the first big step was national.
Yes, the first national modern school was Al-Hidayah Al-Khalifiya, opened in Muharraq in 1919. That came from local notables with the ruler's backing.
Okay.
And 1928 is highlighted as a really remarkable year. Two big things happened.
What were they?
First, the first national school specifically for girls, Khadija Al-Kubra, opened its doors. Huge step.
Absolutely.
And second, the very first Bahraini students were sent abroad on government scholarships. 8 of them went to the American University of Beirut. That's marked as the beginning of higher education efforts.
Wow, 1928. That's quite early for both those initiatives in the region.
It is. Schools came under direct government control in 1930. Then, with oil, came the need for different skills.
Technical skills.
Right, so a technical school opened in 1938, and then the first proper secondary school in Manama in 1939.
And it just kept growing from there,
Yeah.
universities and so on.
Yep. An Education Council in 56, Institute of Teachers in 66, University College in 78, the Arabian Gulf University in 79, and the University of Bahrain formed in 86.
And still developing under H.M. King Hamad.
Yes, the sources mention things like the School of Future project, growth in private universities, establishing the Bahrain Teachers College and Bahrain Polytechnic, a continuous focus on education and skills.
Okay, how about medical services, from traditional medicine to modern hospitals?
Similar path, traditional medicine was the norm. Then the American Mission arrived in 1892, Samuel Zwemer, providing some modern services. That led to the first proper modern hospital built on land donated by Sheikh Isa bin Ali, opening in 1903.
So mission-led initially. When did the government get involved?
Post-oil, they started setting up dispensaries, even a mobile hospital for villages. The first actual government hospital opened in 1939.
Okay.
And a really major step happened under Sheikh Salman. Health services were made completely free for citizens.
Completely free. That's significant.
Very. Then came major hospitals like Salmania, the military hospital, specialized centers like the MKCC for cardiac care, opened in 92.
And still expanding recently.
Yes, under H.M. King Hamad, more hospitals like the King Hamad University Hospital in 2012, which has advanced cancer treatment, and a new building for the MKCC Cardiac Center just opened in 2021. Constant investment in health infrastructure.
What about housing? Providing homes for people?
Well, we mentioned Awali, the oil town, which was the first modern planned city, but that was initially for oil workers. The government started getting involved in housing for citizens more broadly in 1962.
How did that work?
They set up a housing and ownership department. It provided houses for low and middle income citizens who paid it back through monthly installments.
And then they started building whole new towns.
Right. Isatown, opened in 1968, was the first big modern housing city specifically built for citizens. The Ministry of Housing was set up in 76, then Hamad Town followed in 84, plus lots of smaller projects extending existing villages.
And big projects continued into the 21st century.
Yep. Zayed City, Khalifa City, Solomon City are mentioned as more recent large-scale developments. And the types of support have diversified to not just houses, but apartments, housing loans, and newer programs involving banks like Mazaya and Taysir.
Okay, the sources also specifically track the development of women's roles in Bahrain. What did they say?
Well, historically, women were mainly involved in home-based work, maybe some agriculture or handicrafts like basket making, teaching Quran. But that opening of the first national girls' school in 1928, that's presented as absolutely transformative.
Opening doors.
Big time. It gave girls access to modern education, which then allowed them to enter new fields like teaching in the modern schools or nursing later on.
Did they get involved politically early on?
They gained the right to participate in municipal elections back in 1950, and the government started sending female students to study abroad in the 1950s as well.
And women's organizations.
The Bahrain Young Ladies Association, founded in 1955, is noted as the first women's society not just in Bahrain, but in the entire Gulf region.
Wow, another first for Bahrain.
Yeah, and the School of Nursing opening in 1959 also helped strengthen women's presence in the health sector.
But the big constitutional change came later.
Yes, under H.M. King Hamad. The amended Constitution of 2002 explicitly approved women's full political rights, the right to vote, and the right to stand for election.
And have women reached high positions since then?
Definitely. The sources list several specific firsts. The first female minister in 2004, first female judge in 2006, first female ambassador back in 1999.
An ambassador who chaired the UN General Assembly.
That's right, in 2006. Also, the first female elected representative in 2006, and significantly, the first female speaker of the Council of Representatives elected in 2018. Real milestones.
Okay, finally, let's quickly cover the broader infrastructure: electricity, water, transport.
Right. Electricity started with a powerhouse in Manama back in 1929, initially powering lamps and fans. It extended to Muharraq in 31. Bigger power stations came later. A proper water supply network started reaching houses in 1957.
Roads and bridges.
The first surface road was actually built out to the oil camp in 1926. The first petrol station opened in 38. Key bridges connected the main islands, Manama to Muharraq completed in 41, Manama to Sitra in 76.
And the big one connecting to the mainland.
The King Fahd Causeway, linking Bahrain and Saudi Arabia, huge project, opened in 1986, massively important for trade and travel. Started operating very early. Back in the 1930s, first Imperial Airways plane landed in 32. It expanded over the decades, new buildings, jumbo jet facilities, culminating in a brand new, very modern terminal that just opened in January 2021.
Ports.
Evolved, too. From Mina Manama back in 1912 to the deep-water Mina Salman in 67, and now the main port is the Khalifa bin Salman port, opened in 2009, built to handle today's huge container ships.
And phones and posts.
Started early, too. The first post office was actually run by India Post back in 1884. Basic telephone service started in 1932 with just 12 lines and one public phone booth.
Wow, from 12 lines to, well, everyone having a mobile phone today. It's an incredible picture of comprehensive modernization across the board, really.
It really is. Decades of deliberate development.
Okay, so this detailed timeline of modernization brings us to the final section covered in these sources.
Yep.
Economic development and diversification, especially looking towards the future, given those limited oil reserves we keep mentioning. That constraint seems absolutely key to understanding Bahrain's strategy.
It is. They know they can't just rely on oil income forever, unlike some of their neighbors with much larger reserves. The onshore field output is declining. The main offshore field is shared.
And new big finds are considered unlikely, even with ongoing exploration.
That seems to be the general assessment mentioned here, yes.
Yeah.
So the government's strategies, stated very clearly in the sources, has been to spare, and I quote, no effort in attempting to diversify the economy away from just oil and gas.
What were some of the early big non-oil projects?
Well, two major ones stand out. The Arab Shipbuilding and Repair Yard, ASRY, and Aluminium Bahrain, ALBA. These were big industrial ventures.
And they were conceived early on.
Yes, discussed within the context of Gulf economic integration, Bahrain actively pushed to host these kinds of projects. Another major diversification move was deciding to set up an offshore banking sector in 1975.
Right, becoming a financial hub. Were there smaller private sector efforts too?
Oh, yeah. The sources list a whole range of factories making beverages, plastics, tiles, concrete blocks, matches, nails, industrial gases, wood products, air conditioners, food processing, even system-built houses, and, importantly, downstream industries using ALBA's aluminium.
How successful has manufacturing been overall?
The sources describe its performance as somewhat erratic. There was growth, but also setbacks, particularly after the oil price declines in the early 1980s, which caused severe contractions for a few years.
But the drive to diversify remains urgent.
Absolutely. The sources stress there's a particular interest in rapid diversification precisely because the oil won't last forever. Manufacturing and the service sector, especially banking and finance, are explicitly named as the sectors expected to play a key role going forward.
It's interesting that gap you mentioned earlier, oil and gas bringing in maybe two-thirds of government revenue, but only accounting for 20–25% of GDP.
Exactly. It highlights the challenge, doesn't it? The government is still heavily reliant on oil money to pay its bills, even as the wider economy is becoming activity-wise more diversified. Closing that gap is the goal.
How did the offshore banking sector do?
It was pretty successful, especially in the late 70s and 80s. It definitely helped redirect the focus, creating jobs and wealth in a non-oil sector. Though the sources do note an unintended consequence, it tended to increase overall operating costs across other sectors too.
Okay, let's look at ALBA, the aluminium smelter. That was the first really big non-oil industry.
Yes, established back in 1968 by a consortium including the government, Bahrain had some key advantages for this.
Like what?
Cheap natural gas. Aluminium smelting is incredibly energy intensive, so having cheap gas was a massive plus. Also relatively low labor costs, at least initially, and a generally favorable investment climate for such a capital-intensive industry.
Did it make money straight away?
No, apparently ALBA suffered high losses initially, but it became a cornerstone. The government later sold a 20% stake to SABIC, the Saudi Basic Industries Corporation, in 1979, which helped solidify its regional footing.
What's the outlook for aluminium now, according to these sources?
A bit mixed. Prices had increased when this was written, but sustainability was questioned. There were plans to raise overall Gulf output significantly, but world output was rising even faster. Some observers felt older smelters in the US and Europe were becoming obsolete, only kept alive by high prices. So long-term competitiveness is a question mark.
What about ASRY, the shipyard? How did that fare?
That was the second major joint venture, started in 1977, owned by 5 OPEC countries, Organization of Arab Petroleum Exporting Countries. It faced a different kind of challenge.
Which ways?
Shipbuilding and repair is very labor-intensive, and Bahrain, compared to some global competitors, is a relatively high-wage country, so competitiveness was always going to be tough, maybe except for its strategic location.
It is true.
The workload declined quite a bit. From averaging about 110 vessels repaired per year in the late 70s, early 80s, it dropped to around 54 by the mid-80s.
So not purely a commercial success.
Maybe not purely commercial. The sources suggest OPEC's positive evaluation was based more on strategic, long-term developmental and diversification goals. It was seen as important for regional capacity building, even if it wasn't hugely profitable. Investors were apparently willing to subsidize training, trying to Arabize the workforce, build skills.
Interesting. A strategic investment beyond just the bottom line. Is there anything else mentioned on diversification?
There's a very brief mention of a steel venture, AISCO, an iron pelletizing plant started in early 1985, closed after just 3 months due to lack of orders, but then restarted in July 1985 with orders from India and Australia. The source material kind of cuts off there, though, so we don't know how that ultimately played out.
Okay. So if we bring this whole deep dive together, the sources paint a really compelling picture, don't they? Bahrain, this ancient trading crossroads.
Yeah, which then built an entire economy almost totally reliant on natural pearls for centuries.
And that reliance made it incredibly vulnerable. When the pearl market collapsed, combined with the Great Depression, it plunged the country into a really severe economic and social crisis.
Right when things looked bleakest, though, oil was discovered, arriving like a lifeline, really. It provided the money to pull the country out of that crisis and then fund decades of rapid, comprehensive modernization.
Building up everything, infrastructure, education, healthcare, the whole structure of society.
But always with the knowledge, especially compared to its neighbors, that the oil was limited. So from relatively early on, Bahrain consciously pursued this strategy of economic diversification.
Trying to build new pillars for the economy, banking, finance, aluminium, other industries to prepare for a future beyond hydrocarbons.
It's a history that's really marked by these major disruptions, isn't it? The rise and fall of pearls, the arrival of oil, and now the awareness of oil eventually dwindling. And through it all, you see this consistent effort to adapt, to find new economic paths, to deliberately shape the future.
It really shows resilience and strategic thinking over a long period.
Absolutely. So thinking about this whole journey, we've traced through the sources from ancient hub to pearling center, oil pioneer, and now this nation actively working on diversification in the 21st century. Here's something for you, the listener, to mull over.
Okay.
Given Bahrain's unique position, that long history of trade and adaptation, the institutions it's built, but also facing the undeniable challenge of limited natural resources, what do you think might be the most likely next big thing for its economy? As the oil era eventually fades, what sector, what niche could truly define Bahrain's future prosperity? It's a question that flows directly from the history and the challenges highlighted right here in these materials.